afternoon. It's Monday, the 11th of June, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And we're going to get started off with the G7 because, it's not looking too good for the G7, is it?
Well, the G7 used to be the G8 not so long ago, threatening to be, who knows, Mike, the G6.
It's looking that way. Well, let's have a look at what Theresa May had to say, because that's the most important thing to do. And she said, good afternoon. This was her briefing afterwards. She said, at this G7 summit, we have discussed a range of issues, including the vital importance of defending democracy and the rules-based international system. Got to get that in. Free and fair global trade and the need for equal opportunities for all our citizens and the need to protect our oceans. So this is fantastic stuff. She said, foreign interference in our democratic institutions and processes and other forms of malign state activity pose a strategic threat to our shared values and interests. She said that recent events have demonstrated the importance of a unified international response to send a clear message that such malign activity will never be tolerated. We've agreed a new rapid response mechanism and to tackle this growing threat, we've agreed we must maintain the global norm against the use of chemical weapons, and we've agreed to strengthen the ability of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to attribute responsibility for chemical weapons attacks. So just freedom to choose whoever they want as the culprit, and they can just attribute it. No evidence required. Don't worry about that, because this is a rapid response we're taking here, right? She also welcomed, she said, the G7's recognition of the need to maintain sanctions on Russia in light of Russia's failure to implement the Minsk agreements in Ukraine. And she said, we've agreed to stand ready to take further restrictive measures against Russia if necessary. Fantastic stuff. She said on trade and the global economy, we've discussed the importance of multilateral rules-based trading system as the framework for enabling free and fair global trade. But some people feel left behind by globalization, and not all countries play by the rules. So we need to show our citizens that the global economy can truly work for everyone with the benefits of free trade felt by all. This means working to make the international system, including the World Trade Organization, operate more effectively. Now, of course, that's a direct dig at Trump because he has criticized the World Trade Organization recently. But it's the rapid response mechanism that I find particularly interesting. It includes the sharing of threat intelligence, including hostile activity techniques and practices, improving understanding of partner countries' policies and thresholds for taking action, support for independent international institutions, that like the OPCW, for example, working with industry to strengthen physical and digital infrastructure, coordinated attribution of hostile activity. So the OPCW can now just be given the powers to, on a whim, attribute some kind of activity to some particular state player, and there then will be coordinated attribution amongst all the members of the G7, possibly except the United States, but we'll see about that. And here's the most important one, Patrick: joint work to assert a common narrative and response. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, this is pretty spectacular, I think. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but any suggestion of a coordinated attribution of hostile activity and then joint work to assert a common narrative and response, if the mainstream media isn't up in arms about that, then they are complicit.
So the three components here are to transform the OPCW, which is an investigative specializing in chemical investigations, an investigative body, to transform them into a kind of a jury or a legislative body to sort of adjudicate blame for any so-called chemical weapons attack. That's number one. That changes the whole character and the whole purpose of the organization and their role. And any neutrality, Mike, can go right out the window at that point. And by the way, this is not unlike the International Criminal Court, which I might remind everybody the United States doesn't support and hasn't signed on to. And then coordinated attribution of hostilities, is that right?
Yes, the coordinated attribution of hostile activity is how they phrased it.
So to streamline the response, so in other words, to sort of give some sort of legal framework to what we saw on April 13th, a couple of months ago with the tripartite strike on Syria, which was based on a YouTube video. And then number three is to sort of streamline the common narrative. So in other words, we need to get our messaging together. We need everybody on the same page with whatever the official explanation is for the YouTube videos, for instance. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, Mike. This is almost turning into a comedy skit, so I apologize to everybody for our sarcasm, but it's kind of getting to that point where this is that ridiculous. But yet here we are at the G7, Mike, putting this forward as an agenda. Quite amazing.
Absolutely. Now, Donald Trump left early, much to the chagrin of everybody else that was there, which is why we've seen, was it Macron suggesting it might be a G6 in future?
He did. Macron did drift that out, possibly a G6.
So. But why were they so upset with Trump? Well, in fact, he was even suggesting that Russia should be brought back into it. So there seems to be an absolute disparity here between the European leadership and the United States. We'll come on to this a little bit more in a second. So he was saying we didn't do votes or anything, but it has been discussed. Some people like the idea of bringing Russia back. Well, I didn't see too many aside from him that were suggesting that. But one European leader that maybe did agree with him was the Prime Minister of Italy. And he met him at the G7 and has invited him now to go and visit the United States. So this is a bit of a positive. Just met the new Prime Minister of Italy, a great guy. He will be honoured in Washington in the White House shortly. He will do a great job. The people of Italy got it right. So maybe it's going to be a G5.
No, let me just explain what's going on here, Mike, quickly. So if you look at the actual policies of what's happened over the last couple of weeks, or let's say the last month, especially with regards to U.S. threats against, for instance, Germany for its work on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. Take a look at that for a minute. Look at Emmanuel Macron's statements at the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg only 2 weeks ago, sitting next to Putin and being very conciliatory, talking about working together, signing a deal, a provisional deal anyway, small deal, but a start with Total, French petroleum company. Look at these. So Europe, Mike, probably wants Russia back in the G8 as well, but they don't want it to be Trump's idea or Trump's initiative. If this came from a European leader, then the U.S. would probably naturally put pressure on to possibly oppose it, for instance, or they put pressure on Trump not to sort of back such a proposal. So either that, Mike, or Europe has gone more, is taking the Russophobia thing on for some sort of political advantage, or short-term advantage. I can't work out exactly which it is.
Well, of course, what's happened since that meeting 2 weeks ago is that Trump has brought in his tariffs, and perhaps this has changed the scenery somewhat since Macron was making those deals with Putin. But Trump really being pretty aggressive in his language. So he was saying, why should I, as President of the United States, allow countries to continue to make massive trade surpluses as they have been for decades, while our farmers, workers and taxpayers have such a big and unfair price to pay? Not fair to the people of America, $800 billion trade deficit, and add to that the fact that the US pays close to the entire cost of NATO, protecting many of the same countries that rip us off on trade. They pay only a fraction of the cost and laugh. The European Union had a $151 billion surplus, should pay much more for the military. Germany pays 1% slowly of GDP towards NATO, while we pay 4% of a much larger GDP. Does anybody believe that makes sense? We protect Europe, which is good, at great financial loss, and then get unfairly clobbered on trade. Change is coming. And I find that fascinating because, last week we were discussing this on this program, Patrick, and I was reminding everybody of the statement that Trump had made at the inauguration of the new NATO headquarters in Brussels last year. I think it was in June last year, about a year ago. So he was making some pretty bold statements at that event. And in fact, people like Macron, some others were laughing at him while he was doing it. They're not really laughing anymore. They're laughing on the other side of their faces, as it were. And so I just wonder whether whether that feeds into what the sort of reaction at the weekend. This is clearly there's a clear divide here, well, is that reflected in this article in RT?
Well, this is the sort of the reaction coming from Germany. I think this is more a personal reaction by the European leaders against Donald Trump. I think at his style or lack of style when it comes to negotiations, as far as they're concerned, or in terms of how it's being framed in the press. So, and the fact that he's conducting diplomacy via Twitter. So leaving the G7 early, but more importantly, not signing the communique, the joint communique. So effectively, by doing this, the U.S. president is not endorsing the results of this confab, of the meeting. So effectively, Mike, you could say, from a G7 perspective, they're probably saying, well, why did he even come in the first place? Why didn't he just, either not come or send somebody else, maybe sort of a lower tier, maybe even Mike Pence, for instance. But why did the president bother coming? Well, we know why the president came, Mike, because you just outlined that a minute ago. He came to put his foot down and basically come good on a promise that he made at the NATO opening summit. Was that, I believe, in the end of last year?
Middle of last year.
Middle of last year. Yeah. And so he wasn't kidding when he issued that threat about European partners paying their fair share and not ripping us off in trade. So he's wanting some reciprocity here, and this is sort of a multifaceted, you could say 3D, 4D chess deal being constructed here by Trump. So he's trying to get leverage, basically, Mike, because he wants to normalize commitments on NATO, because according to this president and some people in the U.S., that is just completely distorted right now in terms of the support and commitments from NATO. So I'm not surprised, Mike. This follows the same sort of rhetoric. The United States delegations are levying at the UN, for instance. We're paying the bills, but you're not supporting us. This is the transactional diplomacy that is just fast becoming the signature of this Trump administration.
In the chat box, they're asking if the U.S. is not involved, is there any reason for the G7? You got any thoughts on that?
This is a good question. That's a good question. Well, the bigger question to that is, if the U.S. wasn't involved, where would the European partners and Japan and so forth be going with a multilateral meeting? This is a good question. Well, what is the point of the G7, really? Is it superfluous to requirement? I find it interesting, Mike, that the G7, am I wrong, Mike? The G7 always meets days after Bilderberg every year.
Except this year, it's exactly the same time.
It's roughly the same time, yeah. But slightly after. I think all the main meetings, Mike, if I'm not mistaken, and others can correct me on this, Mark Anderson, for instance, but the real meat of Bilderberg takes place on Thursday and Friday. And so those are the real big meetings there. And Saturday, Sunday is just kind of tailing off. And there's some seminars and things like that. So whatever is decided or agreed on or nodded at Bilderberg on Wednesday evening, Thursday and Friday is then sort of, I think, some of the messaging is carried on to the G7 or the G8 formerly meetings just a few days later. So, but we also have other events that are coming up on the schedule as well. So it's a very busy time for decision making for the sort of, let's say, the transatlantic confab.
Well, let's just look at the Murdoch response to this. The U.S. is no longer a country we can trust. That's a pretty spectacular headline.
Well, we've been saying this for quite a long time, and I've said this many times on various segments on other networks, that you have to understand in terms of what they call the global order presently, with the U.S. at the helm, the power that the U.S. has and has wielded since this post-World War II period. Part of this has to do with the reserve currency of the dollar. Of course, that's a big thing, and the petrodollar. And also another part has to do with projecting military power, or more importantly, exporting security, as is more recently known as the sort of raison d'etre of the Pentagon. But the other big thing, the real power, Mike, the real power in this world order, with the U.S. at the helm, okay, comes with the U.S. being perceived as an honest broker, which can settle disputes between countries or take leadership role in moving forward and moving through disputes and problems. If the U.S. loses that position as a trusted broker, or the perception of a trusted broker. It doesn't have to be a trusted broker. If you look back at history, it probably hasn't been, but the perception is from the Pacific to the Atlantic that it is. Once they lose that, then effectively they lose probably the bulk of their power and influence. And this is really important because they're being hosted in hundreds of countries around the world with military bases, and people trust them to move forward with a U.S.-led agenda. If that trust is lost, there's a big problem. There's a potential for breakdowns, fractures, and fissures right across all these global regions.
Okay, well, Trump left early, as we know, from the G7 and headed off to Singapore, where, of course, he, well, you can see him glad-handing with the government there, preparing for the Korea summit.
This is much more his style, isn't it?
Yes.
It's freewheeling. And guess what, Mike? Where's the money right now? Well, the money's in Asia.
Right.
So where's the growth right now? Well, the growth's in Asia. So Trump is there, finds this to be a much more friendly environment, I think, in terms of projecting the sort of agenda he wants to project around this part of the world.
You know, he's there making agreements with the Singapore government. He's saying he's there on a mission of peace when he meets Kim later on. We have to get denuclearization. We have to get something going. We really think that North Korea will be a tremendous place in a very short period of time. We appreciate the working together with North Korea. They're really working very well with us. So I say, so far, so good. It's very important for North Korea and South Korea and Japan and the world and the United States. So what do you think is the likely outcome of this? And what's your thoughts on the reaction to what's going on between Trump and Kim?
We'll see what happens, Mike. But you know, the big danger here, as we spoke about previously as well. I think we might have spoken about this previously. But the big danger is that there's a lot of pressure on Trump to get a win here, especially with the Singapore summit with North Korea. So there's pressure to get a win. What does that mean, Mike? If we look back at past negotiations where the U.S. has been involved in sort of treaties, ceasefires, and so forth, they've been red herrings, and we can talk about the Israeli peace process. Red herrings are inserted in these deals where the other party were saying we cannot sign that. We cannot. North Korea will not sign an agreement that says they may never pursue nuclear weapons or even nuclear power in the future indefinitely. Those sort of ultimatums are going to sort of put negotiations into a deadlock and ultimately kill any process. So that's the Boltons of the world, some of the hawks, the sneakier players there in Washington will definitely be wanting to insert some of these wedges into any sort of agreements. This is probably, Mike, going to be a long, drawn-out process. This meeting will be the first, probably, of a series of meetings. But so that's what to look out for is, you know, is there going to be some rush by this president to get a win before the midterms? Because certainly there's a lot of currency in this coming up with the U.S. midterm elections in November.
So the G7, we've got this, well, Theresa May being pretty aggressive, warlike, and lots of angst within the parties of the G7 and the United States. In the meanwhile, the other meeting that was taking place, as we mentioned on Friday, was the SCO meeting, Shanghai Cooperation meeting, and well, hosted by the Chinese. And as we can see, there's President Xi and President Putin, along with the others. And the language is completely different. Patrick, it's about cooperation, it's about development and offering people win-win scenarios. It's about Belt and Road, of course. And they're talking about respecting each other's choice of development paths, boosting harmony and unity by seeking common ground and setting aside differences, combating the three evil forces of terrorism, separatism and extremism, enhancing cooperation on defense, security and so on. But you know, they're not talking the language of war. President Xi said Shandong is the home province of Confucius and the birthplace of Confucianism, an integral part of Chinese civilization. Confucianism believes that a just cause should be pursued for the common good and champions harmony, unity, and a shared community for all nations. He said its emphasis on unity and harmony has much in common with the Shanghai spirit, namely mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, consultation, respect for diverse civilizations, and pursuit of common development. Well, have we ever heard that type of language coming from one of our illustrious leaders?
Well, we do hear a version of that type of language, but it's usually sort of with the U.S. At the helm, or say NATO at the helm of the conversation. So I think the big danger, Mike, just quickly, we'll move on to the next story, but the big danger with the Belt and Road, the big danger with what you're seeing there is that there are not, this might sound counterintuitive, but there are not major European or American officials right there in the mix. And I'll tell you why. Because the West could easily put China in a position or bait China into a position where there's a potential standoff for resources somewhere, because China will have a huge demand for natural resources, only going to increase in the next couple of decades. And so I think this could be also a strategy, a longer game strategy by the Western powers to sort of allow some situation to develop and then sort of create a crisis out of it and a major military standoff. And of course, then you can have another arms race, much like the one they're having with Russia right now to help build up the military-industrial complex in the West via the Russian threat, by staying out of the Belt and Road conversation and possibly creating a situation or helping to indirectly create a situation for a future standoff would be a perfect opportunity for another arms race against China somewhere along the Belt and Road project. So I think we need everybody, my personal opinion, everybody needs to be involved and in this conversation in a constructive way. And I'm a bit worried that that's not happening, Mike.
I think I agree with that. I think, however, the West is no longer really in a position to be much of a threat necessarily. We see the Western militaries collapsing left, right, and centre. You know, in the United States, you aren't able to drive your naval ships around without crashing them into things. We're basing our air power on an aircraft which tries to kill its pilots. In the West, we don't have anymore the strength perhaps to fulfill that possibility. But as well as that, I would just make the point again that Trump looks like he's looking in that direction, and that perhaps that offers the opportunity for a Western power to get involved in the Belt and Road, and I think that's something that he's thinking about.
Well, Germany is already, is one of China's biggest trading partners, Mike, globally. So if any one country in the West is going to really benefit in a huge way from the Belt and Road project, it has to be Germany. But Germany's kind of laying a bit low diplomatically, I think, on this conversation at the moment. But trust me, Mike, Germany is ready to capitalize on the Belt and Road project in ways that the rest of the European countries might not.
Indeed. But that doesn't stop the war rhetoric building up nonetheless. And here we go. The Daily Mail, I believe, started this, followed on by The Guardian. Is that right?
Sure. This is, this came out, I think it was yesterday or the day before. So Brexit, the new secret Putin connection. That's not anything that would raise any eyebrows on the cover of a Mail paper, Mike, of course. You will look into it. They're talking about Aaron Banks and Andy Wigmore, who were heading the sort of Leave EU campaign back when the referendum was happening. And they had met with Yakovenko, Russian ambassador there in London, on 3 occasions, apparently, during the referendum period and after, Mike. So the implication here is that because they were talking with the Russian ambassador, that somehow that created a situation where voters came out to vote for Brexit. It's still a mystery how all these voters came out, Mike, on the orders of Putin. But this is what the mainstream media will have you believe. Now, that's the charge. And so the Mail, look, Mike, they're demanding the MI5 do something to address the threat, urging MI5 to act. Okay, wow. That's on Sunday. That has serious implications, almost Stasi overtones there. But look at The Guardian. Imagine The Guardian drafting off the Mail. But yet this is what we have in the UK mainstream press. And here MPs calling for, so no longer the MI5, now police must act. We need a police inquiry. So we've gone from MI5 to police into Brexit donors' alleged Kremlin links. So alleged Kremlin links, what are they, Mike? What exactly does this have to do with Brexit? We're not sure. Is this a non-story? I'm guessing, Mike, this is a non-story. Well, and it's just part of a scheduled propaganda campaign of anti-Russian stories that they need to fill a certain amount of paper column inches on the front pages of the dailies with anti-Russian stories. I don't know, like 10 a week or something like that.
Yeah, sure, but in fairness, in the United States, you've managed to get 18 months out of a similar story.
2 years.
2 years.
2 years. We're going on, next month it'll be the Russiagate gravy train will have been running for 2 years. Have you ever seen that film Snowpiercer, where the train just keeps going around and around forever? That's kind of how Russiagate works in the United States. That gravy train never stops, Mike. It'll just keep going and going until it peters out, maybe sometime in 2020 or 2021. I'm not sure.
Well, here's a bit of shocking news about Russiagate then, because ex-Senate aide James Wolfe, accused of lying, goes before a judge, according to is that NBC News? I think it is NBC.
Yes, that's NBC.
So James Wolfe, of course, is security director of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, and he was indicted last week on 3 charges of making false statements to the FBI. About his contacts with reporters who have published classified material, and this could end up with a significant jail sentence. So he was arrested on the 7th of June at his home. He was released on bail on the 8th of June, and he has to appear at FBI headquarters on today to be booked. So this is quite a development. Apparently, some people saying, that this is causing shockwaves around Washington. That's Jonathan Turley, who was reporting in The Hill. And he said he's calling it a cautionary tale for many Capitol Hill members, staffers and journalists. What's going on here? Is this Russiagate scenario falling about it to such a degree that they're actually able to bring indictments against some of the perpetrators?
Well, they're not the perpetrator. In this case, Mike, what was the material that was leaked to the press in these stories wasn't something that undermined the official Russiagate conspiracy theory, but things that furthered it, right? Yeah. So effectively, they're running out of marks, and now they're eating their own. Am I wrong there, Mike? Russiagate's starting to eat itself. But this is just a process crime. This is similar to what the indictments were for Trump aide Papadopoulos and also Michael Flynn. So they've got them on these sort of spurious process crimes, and so lying to the FBI investigators. In the case of both Flynn and Papadopoulos, it's even debatable exactly what the nature of the lie was. It might have been based on the false narrative, the overarching false narrative, which is being presented, so meaningless on many levels. But this one is interesting, Mike, because it's actually, they're taking out one of their own. Of course, some Trump supporters would say, well, that's Trump's magic working its way into the system there, and they're getting the bad guys finally. Trump's managed to sort of transform the FBI and so forth. So if you believe that sort of that line of inquiry, then you'll sort of be cheering about that right now. But I personally, Mike, I think they're running out of targets, they're running out of marks, and now the thing is imploding so fast. And we might see more of these just scattershot indictments and arrests, just trying to look busy.
Well, speaking of liars, Theresa May is a colonialist liar, according to Bashar al-Assad. This is quite a spectacular interview that he's given.
Well, there was an interview. It aired a couple of days ago. If you go to the Daily Mail or one of these websites, the great, really good journalist Khalid Jabber interviewed Bashar al-Assad. I'm telling you, Mike, this is a very important interview. For this point on the historical timeline, this is a very important interview because of what Assad has said and sort of information that he's kind of laid out in this particular interview about what the real sit-rep is in Syria. I think it's really important that people go and check this interview out. So essentially, he's let it rip on the UK. And I'm going to add the Express in this article. If you go back to that story, Mike, I don't know if you can flash that headline, but look at this story. They actually said, they called the first time I've seen, they've labeled the White Helmets as a controversial group called the White Helmets. That's a big change, Mike, from, they say, a few months ago when it was pretty much orthodoxy in the press to say the humanitarian rescue team, the White Helmets, and so forth, or humanitarian NGO. Now they're calling them the controversial group. Mike, does this mean that the brand of the White Helmets is damaged now, that the press have to put qualifiers before their name, like controversial? It's very interesting.
Absolutely. But sanctions on Iran continue to ramp up?
Well, this is the latest, quite an amazing story here. So Nike will not outfit the Iranian World Cup soccer team or football team due to sanctions against Iran. So this is really what I think bad foreign policy getting into sort of contaminate sports. What exactly does the U.S. raft of sanctions against Iran have to do with sporting events and the World Cup and the spirit of international sports? Isn't that the point of international sports, that it sits above politics and above partisan politics and fighting? Well, apparently not. So that's interesting, and I think that's, well, it's kind of rich as well for, I mean, if Nike's willing to make that move, what grounds, Mike? Certainly, can they not make an ethical stance? The amount of sweatshops that Nike's been caught running globally and has apparently done as much as they can to sort of rectify that situation as a corporation, sort of taking a moral lead on these issues. Why can't Nike take a moral lead on this Iran issue? Because, well, let's face it, it shouldn't have anything to do with sport. So, but this is more the politicization of major sports. It's becoming more of a fixture. We've looked at the Olympics, all the Russian doping debacle as well. So it seems to be par for the course now.
Okay, well, Donald Trump obviously looking forward to meeting the Italian Prime Minister, inviting him over to Washington. NATO perhaps a little less sure of themselves. So Jens Stoltenberg has headed over to Italy to meet the new Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. And he thanked the Foreign Minister for Italy's highly valued contributions, including in Afghanistan and Kosovo, and its focus on challenges from the south, which are important to the whole alliance, apparently. So there you go. They discussed preparations for the NATO summit, which is taking place in a month's time in Brussels, including stepping up NATO's efforts to project stability and fight terrorism through the launch of a new training mission in Iraq and more support for Jordan and Tunisia. This is fantastic stuff. So what are your thoughts on this? I mean, it seems to me that NATO clearly nervous about the new government in Italy, and Jens Stoltenberg feeling the need to run over there straight away and say hello.
Well, first of all, was Stoltenberg not already in Italy over the weekend or last week, Mike? For
yes,
Bilderberg?
I believe he was, yes.
So he wasn't exactly running to meet this chap here in Italy, but he was nonetheless there. And so this is a really big, important point for Italy at the moment politically. There's been threats by the new coalition government to be going in the opposite direction of Brussels on the euro and also on Russian sanctions. So this has huge implications there. So my guess, Mike, is that Stoltenberg going over to speak with the Italian minister to sort of see where he stands on the Russian sanctions issue, because this is absolutely paramount, sort of in terms of the cohesion of Europe and NATO, everybody being on the same policy page. But this is a lot of work, Mike, between Brussels, so between the EU policies, between national stances, between NATO stances, between what Washington wants. So many people to please if you're a member of this special club or of both clubs, the EU and NATO, with also the United States bearing over as well. So it's for someone like Italy that wants to go into, looks like a kind of reformist phase right now with the new five-star League coalition led government. Things like this could be problematic. So you're going to see, Mike, the envoys and the emissaries from Brussels really putting a full court press on Italy, a charm offensive. If that doesn't work, Mike, then
start getting aggressive.
So it's now the carrot, but the stick could be following if Italy's not really playing ball with Brussels.
Okay, quick reminder, AV9 DVD collection now available on the UK Column website. There's a bit of a discount on that between now and the shipping date. These will not be shipping until the 1st of July, and then the price will go up to the full price at that point. So you can pre-order now if you wish. Right, COGX 2018 is live. Fantastic stuff. So this is the beginning of London Tech Week. And Matthew Hancock has been busy this morning. He was at the COGX event talking about AI. But before that, he was saying that he was explaining that he doesn't allow his children to have mobile phones. They're under 12 years old. and he thinks that no child should be should be using their phones overnight. So that's pretty good. And of course, this is the man who doesn't particularly like using mobile phones himself. So perhaps there's something in that. But anyway, what was he talking about at CogX? Well, we need gender diversity in AI to reflect the best of society. Apparently, well, he was explaining about his app because he has his own app, the Matt Hancock app.
Okay.
Yeah, and you can download that from various app stores.
Is that a big seller?
I don't know, but apparently he is using Google's AI technology for his app to weed out hate speech to make it a more pleasant place to be.
I see.
So there you go.
There we go.
But he was saying that it's a zero-sum game. That he was talking about tech collaboration between France and the United Kingdom as a big part of his speech. He was saying it was a zero-sum game. A strong France leads to a strong UK when it comes to tech investment. But apparently, this is only one. We'll just remind everybody that this is only one aspect of the new Tory France-UK Franco-British relationship, which extends to defence. Foreign policy, all kinds of things, which is why France is included now in the bombing of Syria in recent weeks. To join the club of two becomes a club of three. This is reflected again in his speech today. Again, no parliamentary discussion of any of this. These merging of French and British institutions is quite a spectacular thing, but we don't need to worry because AI will have gender diversity.
So my question is, if you don't want to have an app on your devices that filters out hate speech, does that make you a bad person?
It's a very good question. but look, we're going to force social media firms to protect children.
Well, this is it. Here it is, the cover of the Telegraph today, demanding that social media firms protect children, must protect the children. So this goes back to really what the Hancock story, or the Hancock app. The Hancock app. Oh dear. This goes back to that story, Mike. So isn't this what they're really talking about? Filters to protect children from terrible ideas, hate speech, bullying, and so forth online. And I can just imagine, Mike, the state's response to somebody like, might say. So my response might be to this story in the Telegraph. I might say, well, why don't parents exert, like Mr. Hancock? Why don't parents exert some influence over their children's digital lives? In other words, does a child of 9, 10, 11, 12 need to have a full-blown smartphone on them at all times and be able to surf and see whatever they like? Is that absolutely necessary for the upbringing and education? And the state's response, of course, is going to be, well, we can't deprive the children of their digital joy and experiences throughout the great digital galaxy that their environment ecosystem that they want to explore as children. So so in other words, instead we need to get the companies to regulate and to filter and to use AI apps to censor, to block out anything might be controversial for children. If you allow this for kids who really shouldn't necessarily be spending all their time online, then it's not going to be long, Mike, until this is extended to the entire adult population, or those who deem not to be competent enough to tell the difference between what is supposedly real news or fake news. That's just an example. This is being talked about right now in a serious way. So unfortunately, this is what's going through the heads of our government's representatives and the Silicon Valley's best and brightest. It's all about control, censorship, filtering, and regulation.
And, Theresa May at the G7 talking about a unified narrative. Well, is Google's AI going to be at the core of that?
Well, if you can automate that unified narrative, even better.
Yeah.
So I think that's exactly what they're talking about.
So how did The Guardian aid anti-Semites?
Well, this is from the great blogger, Jonathan Cook, great writer, great journalist. So you go to his blog. I encourage people to go check out Jonathan's work. Great article here, how The Guardian aided the anti-Semites. And it's just kind of a very clever take on this whole issue. And we discussed this issue on the Sunday Wire yesterday with Gilad Atzmon, a special guest, about this very topic. And that's this whole this whole initiative, this whole effort to shut down any criticism of the state of Israel, its policies, its actions. Look at Gaza over the last 3 or 4 weeks, what's happened there. And this is deemed by the major mainstream press and the Israeli lobby as hate speech or anti-Semitic speech. And so they've leveled these charges at Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, and shamed him and slandered him throughout the media, led by the Times, the Rupert Murdoch Times, of course, leading the charge there. But so Cook's put a very interesting, spin on this, which is the same spin that Gilad Atzmon put more or less yesterday on this interview that we did, which is that the more the state colludes with Israel and the lobby to sort of censor and attack free speech, it's only going to feed more angst and potential opposition to this lobby and to the things that it's doing and to Israel. So they're compounding the problem they're supposedly wanting to sort of, deal with and slow down, which is this alleged anti-Semitism. So I think it's a really important conversation. People need to start engaging in this conversation right now.
Okay, David Lidington, the Cabinet Office Minister, was writing in the Telegraph this morning, it's time to roll back, or yesterday I think this was, it was time to roll back the amendments and adopt the original withdrawal bill. This is the EU withdrawal bill, the so-called Great Repeal Bill, which only repeals one act of Parliament, which is the 1972 European Communities Act, and then brings all the full body of EU legislation formally onto the British statute books. So, of course, there's been quite a number of amendments made to that in the House of Lords, which has driven a whole lot of angst against the House of Lords over the couple of months. People calling for the House of Lords to be scrapped once again, replaced with some kind of upper chamber that with elected
chamber.
Thank you. That was the word that I couldn't think of. Yes, exactly. So he's saying this week, when the EU withdrawal bill returns from the House of Lords, members of Parliament face a stark choice. During its time in the upper house, the bill has been amended in ways that go far beyond its primary purpose. Changes relating to some of the most contentious questions at stake in the Brexit process have been tacked onto the bill with the avowed intention of damaging the Brexit process. Well, Mr. Lidington, I have to say, I think you, Theresa, and your other colleagues are doing a perfectly good job of that without trying to divert your attention or people's attention onto what the House of Lords did, because of course this bill does come back to the House of Commons, and the MPs there have the opportunity to agree with or undo any of the changes that the House of Lords has made. But then he was speaking on the Andrew Marr show yesterday morning, and of course the big problem, just one example of the problems that the current government is bringing in their own efforts to leave, in inverted commas, the European Union, is this idea of a backstop position on the customs union. And he's saying that, he refused to say whether a backstop deal would be over by the end of 2021. Now, this current government, assuming it gets that far to full term, expires in 2020. So he's now talking that he says it's Theresa May's intention. She intends. And it's his hope. He hopes. So that's fantastic. That's guaranteed then, because he hopes that the backstop deal would be over by 2022. Patrick, we have said here at the column from the beginning that this whole thing was a fraud, that we would effectively be in every institution that the Tory government had intended us to be in as part of the Best of Both Worlds white paper. That clearly is what's going on. We're supposed to be leaving in March 2019, but then we were supposed to have a transition period of up to 2 years. But in fact, it looks like we will be in the customs union and the single market until 2022 now at the latest. And it just keeps eking further and further out. This is, everybody that voted for Brexit is being stabbed in the back, which unfortunately is what we said would happen. But I come back to the original point, which is, why did anybody trust this particular government to do what they said they would do?
That's a good point. And just my last thing I'm going to say about the House of Lords, that's been used as a whipping boy in recent weeks during this Brexit controversy, that if you're going to scrap the House of Lords, then just bear in mind that you have then two choices. Do you want to keep your hereditary peerage chamber, or would you like a bought and paid for Senate? which is bought and paid for by corporations, you have to actually think about that very carefully, because that's the choice that you'll be given.
Well, that is true, but there is a third choice, which is another whipped upper chamber, which becomes sort of, well, I can't even describe what it becomes, but some sort of bastard child of the House of Commons. I mean, this is it's a terrible ideal.
That's the scariest option,
Yes.
actually, but that's probably the most likely looking at it right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you very much for joining me, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow, 1 p.m. We will see you then. Bye-bye.